So we were asked today to start with an artifact. My artifact is a parking lot. It's not just any old parking lot, though. It is specifically a parking lot off of Interstate 95 in Milford, Connecticut, in the United States. Most importantly, in early 2013, this parking lot became the site of what turned into a vicious flame war between Elon Musk, who we've already heard of today, the entrepreneur behind SpaceX and Tesla, and John Broder, a reporter from the New York Times. Tesla had approached the Times to do a test drive of its new electric vehicle, the Model S, and a system of supercharger stations that they had installed along the eastern seaboard. Suffice it to say, without going into too much detail, that Broder's test drive did not go well, and he emphatically panned the Model S in his review in the Times, complete in true New York Times style with an infographic tracking the series of misfortunes that Broder encountered on his drive. Needless to say, Musk was less than pleased with the outcome of the review, and in a blog post on Tesla's website, he penned a point-by-point rebuttal of Broder's review, including a markup of the Times infographic a la Reddit. Musk claimed that Broder went out of his way to ensure that the car would fail, and he supported this claim with a variety of graphs based on quantitative data collected from the car's sensors during Broder's drive. And one of these focused on the parking lot in Milton, Connecticut. Musk claimed that when Broder arrived in this parking lot with close to zero charge left in his battery, instead of going directly to the charging station, he drove the car for more than half a mile at very low speeds. And for proof of this, Musk gives us an annotated chart of the car's velocity, which shows the car's deceleration into the parking lot, and then half a mile of stop and start before arriving at the charging station, which he says shows that Broder was trying his best to make the car fail, to make it run out of charge before reaching the charging station. Now, Broder, who never mentioned the parking lot in his original article, responds by saying that he had to spend 10 minutes driving around the parking lot looking for the charging station, which was not lit and therefore very difficult to find at night. He wasn't avoiding the charging station. He was, in fact, doing his very best to find it. Now, we may never know exactly what happened on this evening in Milford, Connecticut, but the incident does offer us several insights into the challenges of understanding spatiality and social complexity through data. First, it's important to recognize that what Musk gives us is not data. It's a graphical and heavily annotated representation of that data. And this representation reveals Musk's own positionality and theoretical predisposition. Musk sees this episode through the lens of the electric car, whose charge varies as a function of distance and speed. What he fails to see is Broder's experience as a user, which might be mediated by the car, but is not an experience of the car as such. Rather, Broder's experience is of the parking lot, its spatiality, poorly lit, labyrinthine, and the resulting difficulty of finding the charging station. Broder himself is also concerned with the car's charge, but as a function of time and his ability to find the charging station in a poorly lit parking lot. This experience is impossible to comprehend without actually driving around the Milford parking lot at night. And it highlights the special challenge that spatiality, the three-dimensional spatial sensorium that we experience every day as the city, presents to any effort to analyze the city through data, even through data that is better spatially contextualized than Musk's. Despite this, Musk's representation of the car's quantitative data is highly persuasive, and thousands of readers wrote into the New York Times to lambast Broder for journalistic misconduct. Quantitative data takes on a facticity that obscures the theoretical and interpretive choices that contribute to its production. And more data, big data, does not always make our theories better. Quantitative data is a remarkably good tool for verifying theory, for confirming or disproving theory, but it doesn't always do well at producing new theory. And like any tool, data can be used for both good and ill. It can be used to verify theories that are accurate, but it can also be used to verify theories that are biased or misguided. Musk had lots of data, but a misguided theory for what they meant, and this led him to questionable, but nonetheless persuasive conclusions. And this, I would argue, is the real danger of data, that it can lead to greater confidence, but not always in the right things. Broder, by contrast, had an outstanding theory of what had gone on. He had what could be argued the only theory that really mattered, his own experience of what he was trying to do with the car. But he lacked the data to prove his theory correct. And this is in part because Broder, separate and apart from any issues of journalistic integrity, was not doing a particularly good job of being a qualitative researcher, of rigorously documenting and analyzing his experiences and their meaning. As the New York Times public editor, Margaret Sullivan, later wrote in an opinion piece, quote, "Mr. Broder left himself open to valid criticism by taking what seemed to be casual and imprecise notes along the journey." Now, done well, qualitative research gives us the context that quantitative data lacks. And it is context that allows us to generate theory, to develop new ways of understanding the world and its meaning. In her opinion piece, Sullivan goes on to say, "A little red notebook in the front seat is no match for digitally recorded driving logs." And I think here Sullivan goes just one step too far, unduly pitting the qualitative against the quantitative. For me, Broder and Musk are allies, or they should be allies, not enemies. The moral of the story is that the quantitative and the qualitative need each other. To build a smart city or a smart nation, we need data, but we also need theory. Now, to explore the implications of this at a scale slightly beyond a parking lot, I want to switch gears. And I want to do something that might seem somewhat heretical in a conference that is entitled Future Everything. I want to go 60 years into the past. Yes, that's right. We're going back to the future. Now, this isn't a Model S, it's a DeLorean, but you get the idea. This move to history is an important one because the idea of the smart city or the smart nation is not new, nor is the use of data as a tool to understand and shape the city. Doxiadis, for instance, purchased one of the earliest computers in order to model data about human behavior in order to drive his work on acoustics. And believe me, Doxiadis thought his data was big too. Indeed, the city is in some sense a data object par excellence. In the transition from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft, from the familiarity of the community to the anomie of urban society, we are suddenly faced with a social and spatial entity that can no longer be directly experienced and understood. To understand the city, it must first be mediated through data, through abstraction. And by the same token, data fuels the drive to improve the city, to make it more legible and more manageable. We see this in Haussmann, in Corbusier, in Moses. And in this sense, the smart city is just the latest iteration in a long tradition that James Scott might characterize as authoritarian high modernism. The belief that science can be used to improve society and the power to make it so. And this indeed is what drove the Great Leap Forward. And no, he's not driving a Model S. This isn't an episode that we often encounter when we talk about data and urban design, but it is, or an argument could be made, for it being one of the first efforts to create a smart nation. Not one like the one we're discussing today based on sensors and algorithms, but based on the collection of data on a massive scale and the coordinated direction of human activity based on that data. Lasting from 1957 to 1963, the Great Leap was Mao's effort to skip a generation in industrialization, to, for instance, surpass Britain's steel production in just 15 years, a target that was soon revised to just 1 year. Part of the Great Leap relied on voluntarism and ideology, on inspiring people to produce more. But in part, China's leaders aspired to a fully systematized, planned economy in which the nation's newly established organizational and statistical capabilities would be used to determine what each part of the country would produce and how much. A massive nationwide drive for industrialization and urbanization that represents the single largest planning effort in human history. For the first 3 years of the Great Leap, China entirely abandoned price signals and individual choice in the production of agriculture, and instead relied on a smart system with a centralized decision-making apparatus operating based on distributed information collection through the network of party cadres. Indeed, part of the reason that China's leaders felt so confident in launching the Great Leap Forward is because the gathering of statistics at a national scale suddenly enabled them to see how much food the country was producing, a steadily increasing agricultural surplus. Now, before I go further, it's necessary to give you a spoiler. The Great Leap Forward did not work out well. It resulted in perhaps the single greatest man-made disaster in history, the Great Leap Famine, in which tens of millions of people lost their lives to starvation over just a 3-year period. Now, there are a variety of factors that contributed to this disaster. One that is often pointed to is the quality of data China's leaders were receiving from the provinces. As the story goes, local leaders, scared of what might happen to them if they underperformed, over-reported production numbers, particularly in agriculture, resulting in exaggerated estimates in aggregate. For instance, the official estimate of the 1958 harvest was 375 million tons of grain, nearly double the total output for the previous year. This in turn led to higher grain requisitions by the government at nearly 40% of the actual output in 1959. This was grain that was being shipped to urban areas to feed industrial workers, leaving rural people with barely enough and oftentimes not even enough to survive. Now, I want to complicate the story just a bit and suggest that this aspect of the Great Leap Famine was not necessarily produced by bad data, but by dumb theory, and a refusal to acknowledge alternative sources of often qualitative data. There is no such thing as good data or bad data. Data simply is. It faithfully represents the world that produced it, including the instruments, processes, and assumptions of the people who had a hand in its production. Mao got data that faithfully represented the incentives and processes of the new regime at a local level, but he interpreted that data as a faithful representation of the actual amount of grain that was produced. This was an instance of bad theory, not bad data. Mao could only see his cadres as part of an efficiently working system, as cogs in the machine of the state, not as social beings, full of conflicting incentives and motivations. This error was compounded by a deliberate effort to ignore other sources of data that challenged, rather than verified, Mao's theory that collectivization and communization was working better than they had ever hoped. This included statistics showing declining grain stockpiles in the cities and the sight of starving people in the city's streets. Emboldened by the larger amount of positive data that he was receiving from the provinces, Mao ignored these warning signs and interpreted them instead as evidence that not enough grain was being requisitioned by the state. Grain requisitions increased, only further exacerbating the situation in the countryside and removing the contradictory evidence of starvation in the city, a massive case of confirmation bias. Again, the problem here is not that his data was bad. In fact, Mao had plenty of data telling him that the food situation was dire. But his theory of what was happening in the country was so firmly held that he focused only on the data that confirmed it. Now, with the help of historical hindsight, Mao's mistake might seem an obvious one, and it might seem easy to write off the Great Leap Famine as an instance of human error that could have been avoided had China's statistical system simply been automated. But sensors and algorithms, built and programmed by human hands, are just as prone to the assumptions and biases that plagued the Great Leap. And indeed, they are even less adept at sensing the social and spatial complexity of the human world. The Great Leap thus serves as a parable for any effort to use data in the betterment of our cities. Data can do a lot of good. It can help us to build adaptive, resilient, thriving cities that respond to the needs of our citizens. But data can just as easily give strength to misguided ideas. And as we can see, this isn't just a matter of a tiff between a tech entrepreneur and a Times reporter. At the scale and complexity of the city or the nation, the consequences can indeed be grave. So, what can we learn from Musk and Mao? First, to build smart cities, we need two things. We need data, but we also need theory. We are in an era in which we have increasingly powerful tools for the collection and analysis of data, but we often forget the second part, powerful theory. Too often, we're approaching these amazing new data capabilities with the same old theories we've always used, sometimes just warming over systems theory from the 1950s. We might get incrementally more precise in our understanding of the city, but this approach inevitably fails to reveal anything fundamentally new. And in some cases where our theory is misguided, our new capabilities actually pose a threat. They can make us more confident of bad decisions. Now, where does new grounded theory come from? It comes from context, and specifically, it comes from the social and spatial complexity of lived experience, precisely what Mao and Musk both lacked in their approaches to data. Let me put this another way. As planners and designers of cities, we aren't designers of systems. We're designers of lived experiences, as Jacqueline has already highlighted. To go back to the Milford parking lot, too often we see our cities from the perspective of the car as a system of variables rather than seeing the parking lot, that is, the lived experience of the city's spatiality. By the same token, we also often forget the social complexity that goes into the relationships and individual decisions that make up the city and its data streams. Finally, how do we generate theory from such complexity? And I would argue that smart city theory, that our understanding of context and complexity is a function of good qualitative research. That we need to employ ethnographers and other qualitative researchers trained to investigate, analyze, and synthesize sociospatial complexity in the urban, better than John Broder did. My provocation here is that for each data scientist we hire, we should also be hiring an ethnographer. This research can serve as the basis for new theory that can then be tested by our new data capabilities. We too often think of the qualitative and the quantitative as opposed paradigms, but the qualitative and the quantitative need each other. Without both, without the theory to go along with the data, we're just shooting in the dark. And the outcome could just as easily be a dumb city as a smart one. Thank you.